Hi, I'm David Smith, and this is In a Word. You know, some words we use so often that we never really stop and define what those words mean. You are watching the Gospel Broadcast Network, and we often on this program and in others talk about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Maybe today we ought to stop and think about what the word gospel means. Paul writes in Ephesians 1:13, "In whom also ye trusted, after that you heard the word of truth," notice the gospel of your salvation, "in whom also after that you believed, you were sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise." Notice Paul talks about the gospel of their salvation. In Romans 1:16, the apostle writes and says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." In these two verses, the Apostle Paul clearly speaks of the gospel as the element by which men are saved. And so we often use that word as a reference to the programming that we're involved in, and we're in the process of delivering the gospel to the world. But do we know what the word gospel itself means? Now, you could stop and just look at verses like this, and I think that any honest person could read a verse where Paul talks about the gospel of salvation and how that we're not to be ashamed of the gospel of Christ because it's the power of God unto salvation. And we could honestly say, now, if that's a message that brings salvation, that is some good news. You could honestly say that, right? But did you know that's the exact meaning of the word euangelion? The word gospel simply means the good news. Now, it's interesting because there are many roots to that word, and there's some etymology that's involved, but in the end, it just carries the sense of being the good news of Jesus Christ. The only way that we're ever able to discern that this is what the gospel is for men is that the word means that it's the good news. Interestingly, the word itself in its root form means to proclaim or to tell the truth, and then a few additions are added to that, and simply it means good when the little prefix is added to it, the compound words are brought together, and so it just means the good proclamation, the good telling. So I want you to think about with me for just a second the word gospel and why it is so good, why it's such good news. First of all, notice that when inspired men speak of the gospel, they're talking about the gospel, not a gospel. There is only one message that is good news. There's not a single other message that is existing that can equal the good news of the gospel. There's no choice between two gospels. There's only one. There's not even a multiplicity of gospels, just one gospel. So there's only one message of good news. And it reminds us of a statement that Paul makes in Galatians 1:6-9. When he says, "I marvel that you're so soon removed from Him that called you into the grace of Christ into another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you." And he warns them, if there be any other man, even an angel, that would preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached, or even that which we've delivered, according to verse 8 and 9, let him be accursed, let him be estranged from God. Why? Because there's only one gospel message. So when we speak of the gospel, let's make sure that we're not talking about a gospel. There's not a good news, it is the good news. Notice also that the gospel is the good news because it is alone the message of salvation. There is salvation found in no other message on the face of this earth than the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so that's why it is the good news, not a good news, the good news. Also notice, according to Paul in Romans 1:16, that because it is the good news, we should never be ashamed of it. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news, because it is the power of God unto salvation. You know, do you find it interesting that we can almost always engage men in a conversation about anything except the gospel? And yet what better information, what better news is there to talk about than the good news of Jesus Christ? I know it's easy to talk about sports and politics, and we can talk about our jobs and every other thing, but shouldn't we mostly and primarily talk to men about the gospel because it's the good news? Also notice that the goodness of the message can only be received by people who receive it in obedience. It's the good news, yes, but the only way that we will ever experience the goodness of that news is if we obey what it requires us to do. In Mark 16:15 and 16, Jesus says, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel, the good news to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned." So we must make sure that we obey the good news so that we can receive the goodness of that message. Aren't you thankful that when Jesus and the entire writers of the New Testament describe the message that we have today, that they describe it as the good news, because truly there's not another gospel. That's been our word for the day. I'm David Smith, and this is In a Word.